Welcome back to Historical Secrets, where the strangest, darkest corners of history are illuminated by curiosity and a touch of chill. Tonight, we'll talk about the safety inventions of the Middle Ages, which may sound noble, but were actually the results of mistakes, tragedies, and sometimes unbelievable cruelty. Each mechanism, each idea from that era tells a story, not just of intelligence, but of the fear and greed that brought it to life. If you love the way we uncover the dark side of the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because here every week we peel away another layer of dust from history to uncover why humanity created such madness. Now, turn off the lights, lie back comfortably, and get ready, because you're about to learn the real reasons behind the strangest safety features ever invented in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were the time when humanity's first safety measures were born, not because people were smarter, but because they had died too many times in the same way. Every crack in a castle wall, every rickety hanging bridge hid a story of stupidity, pride, and sometimes misunderstood courage. And strangely, while we now call those structures monuments of history, to those who lived back then, they were simply giant machines waiting for someone to slip. Let's start with one of the most famous symbols, the moat, the muddy circle of death surrounding castles across Europe. It looked grand and strategic, but it was actually a silent killer. People thought moats were made to keep enemies out, but in reality, they also kept out servants, cooks, and especially drunk knights returning from feasts. Many chronicles tell of brave guards who, in the morning, stood tall in armor, only to be pulled from the mud at night, still wearing the same heavy steel suit. The moat wasn't just deep, it was filthy, literally. It wasn't a sparkling stream like in illustrations, but a dump filled with waste, animal carcasses, and everything people didn't want to carry across the bridge. So if anyone slipped and fell in, they didn't just drown, they died from infection. It was the medieval version of dying in a toilet, except the toilet stretched for tens of meters and had dead fish in it. When lords realized more people drowned in their moats than enemies killed, they came up with an idea. Maybe we should add some ropes or build a fence. And thus, the first safety measure in castle history was born, not out of kindness, but to avoid funeral hassles. And what about the battlefield? That was where humans turned mistakes into tradition. At first, helmets were considered optional. Knights believed God would protect them from all blades, until the first sword struck Geoffrey's skull. The earliest helmets looked like metal bowls turned upside down, crafted by blacksmiths rather than designed by doctors. They protected the head, but robbed something equally important: breath and sight. The wearer couldn't see clearly, couldn't breathe, and could barely hear commands. But they still wore them because in those days, survival mattered less than looking brave. The Crusades brought these helmets to scorching deserts, where the heat inside was enough to boil an egg. Many knights fainted mid-battle, face down in the dirt, while the enemy politely waited for them to wake up before continuing. The problem was solved by adding padding and ventilation holes until someone realized those holes were perfect targets for crossbow bolts. Yet the helmets remained, becoming symbols of loyalty and temporary deafness. Then there was height, humanity's silent enemy. In the Middle Ages, people loved to build tall watchtowers, balconies, church bells. If it could be climbed, someone would try standing on top to admire the view. Unfortunately, the law of gravity had not yet been invented, at least not in their minds. Every tower was a regular experiment in human bone endurance. Records from the time tell of workers falling from scaffolds, monks tumbling from windows while cleaning statues, and noble women falling off balconies trying to catch sunlight. The safety measures of that era didn't come from compassion, but from funeral fatigue. After too many guests left parties by the shortest route to the courtyard, nobles decided to install railings. But since aesthetics mattered more than life, the railings reached only knee height. The drunks still fell, children still slipped, and churches kept praying, "Please don't die here." Yet it was a small but significant step in the history of safety, proof that sometimes human evolution begins with a fall. Later, Gothic buildings started to feature solid walls, stairways made of rough stone instead of slippery wood. Builders began to learn that beautiful did not mean survivable. Still, they failed to consider one variable. Medieval people were extremely drunk. Every railing, every rope merely delayed death by a few seconds for those determined to test Newton's law with their own bodies. And if you think the worst fall was from a bell tower, wait until you hear about medieval toilets, where a single visit could be your last. No plumbing, no tiles, just a thin wooden plank hanging over a deep pit of waste. One small mistake, and you'd fall into the abyss of regret. Many nobles even died in a meditative position, plunging straight down from their wooden thrones. That's why people called toilets back then the most dangerous place in the castle. After countless accidents, people finally realized that caution itself was the greatest invention. Stronger planks, better hinges, and then lids were invented, not because anyone cared about privacy, but because they were tired of holding funerals in the toilet. Looking back, we see that every safety feature of the Middle Ages was written in blood, sweat, and bitter laughter. From deadly moats to suffocating helmets, from knee-high railings to lethal toilets, all stand as proof of one truth. Humanity only learned safety after losing enough people to carve the lesson into stone. There was nothing that couldn't be solved with a cup of beer or by blaming the devil. When the sun set, taverns became the place where stupidity, bravery, and alcohol levels converged to create stories no one wanted to retell the next morning. And it was there that the first safety features of public life were born, not out of concern, but out of exhaustion from the same unfortunate incidents happening again and again. Imagine a wooden tavern with a low ceiling, filled with smoke, where laughter, shouting, and the clash of metal blended into a chaotic symphony. Oil lamps flickered, fat dripped, beer flooded the floor, and in the corner, a group argued over who had looked at whom the wrong way. No one knew the rules, perhaps because there weren't any. One minute, you're toasting a bountiful harvest, and the next, you're testing the hardness of a wooden chair. And if you happen to fall into the fireplace, congratulations! You just became the reason the whole village had to rebuild the tavern. It was in that very atmosphere that the first primitive safety laws began to form. Tavern owners, after dozens of brawls and fires, realized that if too many customers died, they'd run out of business. The solution? Stone walls instead of wood, fireplaces with grates, and even a no swords allowed rule. A bold idea that deeply offended many knights. But the results were clear. The number of deaths in taverns dropped, while the number of injuries rose significantly. Progress by medieval standards. Still, drunkenness remained a national plague. Workers, peasants, monks, and nobles alike turned to beer as a cure for everything: sadness, war, or simply thirst. And as a result, every night ended with at least one person resting on the floor, next to a fire or a roasting pig. Some towns tried to impose curfews on taverns, but as you might guess, no one obeyed. There were no police, no consumer safety laws, only a long list of lessons written in blood and spilled beer. Then, a group of people suddenly realized if you couldn't stop villagers from drinking, at least try to stop them from burning down the village. And that's when something we now call building regulations appeared. New taverns were required to place kitchens away from dining areas, use stone for fireplace walls, and keep water barrels outside. It sounds obvious now, but back then it was a leap comparable to inventing the fire extinguisher. Of course, the effectiveness was relative. When you put a water barrel next to a tavern, 10 people would drink it before anyone thought of putting out a fire. However, not every tragedy was caused by fire. In rural areas, another danger lurked in the dark: wells. Wells were sources of life, but also open traps of death. No covers, no fences, just a deep, yawning hole and countless stories ending with, and then they fell in. Children, animals, even drunk villagers returning from taverns were common victims. Eventually, people started doing what every advanced civilization does when tired of accidents. They covered them. A simple wooden plank, a warning rope, sometimes even a stone lid. Yes, the well cover, a great invention born from sheer annoyance. Meanwhile, big cities began to realize that slippery cobblestone streets, no railings, and piles of horse dung were a perfect recipe for accidents. As crowds grew, falling, colliding, or being run over by carriages became so common that authorities had to act. And acting meant putting up warning signs. Not slow down signs, but wooden plaques hand-carved with messages like caution, steep road, stupid horse, or don't walk if it's raining. Silly as they were, these were the ancestors of modern public safety systems. And you know what? They even started digging drainage ditches, not for cleanliness, but because too many people were slipping into the mud. But perhaps the strangest safety measure appeared in churches. After centuries of losing bell ringers to lightning strikes, priests decided that if you couldn't fight nature, at least stay away from it. Some churches began installing automatic bells, not electric, but pulley systems that could be operated from a distance. The bell ringers now stood indoors, and the chance of being roasted alive dropped significantly. It was a notable technological improvement, even if the main motivation was simply not wanting another corpse at Sunday Mass. And so, through every disaster, every scream, every fire and fall, medieval people slowly learned what we now take for granted. If something can kill you, it will, unless you do something to stop it. The ropes, planks, iron bars, and warning signs weren't born from genius, but from desperation. Yet it was these very things that, bit by bit, turned the world from a place of constant peril into one where survival was no longer a daily miracle. So next time you see a railing, a slippery when wet sign, or a sturdy toilet lid, remember that it all began with the people of the Middle Ages, those who had to fall, burn, and die many times so we could live safely in the modern stupidity of our own making. Those curfews weren't sophisticated tools of social control. They were simply a way to stop people from destroying themselves after sunset. When the church bells rang, signaling curfew, everyone knew it was time to extinguish torches, close doors, and pray that no one got trapped outside, because going out after dusk was a game with death. If you didn't fall into a sewer, you might be robbed, or worse, sink into a puddle people called a street. In London, Paris, or Prague, people said the sound of the curfew bell was like the sound of survival. It signaled, cover the fire, the French phrase couvre-feu, which later became the word curfew. And quite literally, if you didn't cover your fire, there was a high chance that by morning, the entire neighborhood would turn into a giant stove. One of the leading causes of medieval urban fires wasn't dragons, it was humans. So cities implemented real cover the fire orders. When the bells rang, every household had to cover their hearth with a metal or ceramic lid. No cooking or open flames were allowed after hours. It sounds harsh, but it saved the world from having to rebuild a town every week. The problem was, no one liked being told when to go to bed. And as always, humans found creative ways to endanger themselves. People secretly lit candles under blankets, hid hot coals under their beds, or took wine into the backyard just to warm up a little. By morning, that little warmth often turned into a pile of ashes. With all that collective stupidity, it's a wonder so many medieval people survived long enough to invent new safety measures. One of those came from the kitchen, not the kind of kitchen fires you've heard about before, but the evolution of a familiar object, the knife. In earlier times, knives were personal tools carried by everyone to eat, cut, and, if necessary, defend themselves. But as communal dining became common, dozens of people sat together with dozens of blades, and accidents occurred so often that even the church had to intervene. In the 17th century, Cardinal Richelieu of France was said to have ordered the blunting of table knives because he was tired of seeing nobles pick their teeth and stab each other during dinner. That's how the world got the table knife, one of the first safety innovations in culinary history. Rounded tips, smooth handles, not too sharp to wound, but sharp enough to cut meat. It's ironic that something once symbolizing power was redesigned simply because humans couldn't be trusted with sharp metal. Of course, these advancements didn't stop at the dining table. Even in architecture, people learned to protect themselves from the things they built. A fascinating example is the spiral staircase, a hallmark of medieval castles. Designed to twist clockwise, it allowed defenders, standing above, to swing their swords more easily while restricting attackers climbing from below. But beyond its military use, it was also one of the first safety features in construction. Thanks to the narrow, enclosed, spiraling design, the risk of falling decreased significantly, unless you were running, drunk, or being chased, in which case nothing could save you anyway. Yet, perhaps the true pioneer of medieval safety lay in something unexpected: clothing. After centuries of burns, explosions, and poisonings, tailors began thinking beyond fashion. They experimented with linen, wool, and leather, not just for appearance, but for durability and fire resistance. Wool garments, for example, were naturally more flame resistant than cotton, which is why nobles often wore multiple thick layers. It turned out they weren't just showing off wealth, they were trying to survive when parties got too heated. Meanwhile, common folk relied on experience and luck. Every household had its own set of oral safety rules. Things like don't sleep near the fireplace, don't light candles when the wind's blowing in, and if you hear the bell, run outside. Safety evolution didn't happen in laboratories, but in kitchens, taverns, and churches. The most dangerous places became survival classrooms. And perhaps nowhere was that clearer than in the blacksmith's forge. Medieval blacksmiths worked with molten metal, heavy hammers, and a very loose definition of safe distance. Accidents were so frequent that forges began adopting basic rules, like wearing gloves, keeping clothes dry, and not letting apprentices stand in front of the hammer. Some records even show that early blacksmiths used animal hides or thick aprons to shield their chests and legs, the ancestors of modern protective gear. That was the moment humanity began thinking of safety as part of the job, not an act of divine mercy. By the end of the Middle Ages, these small improvements had accumulated into something greater, the concept of prevention. People gradually realized that not every accident was God's will. Sometimes it was just because they were too stupid to cover a well or blow out a candle. And from those lessons, the modern world began to form, a world with streetlights, fire extinguishers, and workplace safety laws, all born from the mistakes lamented in monastery journals. Ironically, collective stupidity became the engine of civilization's evolution. Every well cover, candle guard, and curfew wasn't just an object or a rule, it was a monument to learning through blood. So when you walk into a building today and see signs like no smoking or emergency exit, remember that those words were written over centuries of foolishness, bravery, and sometimes a little burning. The Middle Ages may have been dark, but thanks to them, we learned how to keep humanity's flame alive without setting ourselves on fire. Medieval monasteries are often praised as places where souls were purified, separated from the world. But behind those quiet stone walls was a reality full of smoke, candle wax, and the risk of fire. A monastery housed hundreds of candles, embroidered cloths, and dry wood, all combining into a perfect formula for disaster. The women who chose to leave the world behind in search of peace ultimately had to learn how to live with the danger of fire consuming their sanctuary. Thus, the first religious safety measures were born not from devotion, but from the instinct to survive. Thick stone walls were built to prevent fire from spreading between sections. Oil lamps were enclosed in metal cages. Some monasteries even established a peculiar rule: do not pray alone while holding a torch. It sounds like a joke, but it reflected a very real fear that a single careless moment could turn the house of God into ashes. And if there was anything medieval people revered second only to God, it was superstition. Every extinguished flame was not only an act of prevention, but also a ritual, as if they were snuffing out their sins along with the fire itself. Gradually, the concept of safety spread beyond monastery gates. In bustling markets where blacksmiths, carpenters, and cooks crowded together, people began to learn that God was not always the only reason for their injuries. When a blacksmith lost a hand because he forgot to keep distance from his hammer, or a cook caught fire when oil spilled from a pan, they called it God's will. But when it happened too often, God's will quickly turned into, we need to do something. And so the concept of prevention, a word that didn't even exist in the medieval dictionary, began to take shape, forged from blood and ashes. Simple rules appeared. Don't use fire near cloth, keep alcohol away from the stove, or don't sing hymns next to boiling oil. In some monasteries, nuns invented primitive fire alarm systems, hanging small bells near the kitchen, ready to ring if the smoke grew too thick. Naive as they were, those inventions became the foundation for the modern concept of indoor safety. Interestingly, these desperate inventions not only saved lives, but also opened a completely new way of thinking. Medieval people began to realize that technology could save them. The chimney, for example, was one of the greatest advances of that century. Before its invention, smoke from the hearth filled entire rooms, leaving everyone coughing in thick, black haze. But when someone thought to carve a hole in the roof to let the smoke escape, they unknowingly laid the first brick of architectural safety. That crude smoke hole later evolved into chimneys, fireplaces, and eventually modern ventilation systems. However, for medieval people, every innovation came with a curse. Dry wooden roofs could soak up rain and collapse at any time. Thick stone walls trapped heat so well that they also trapped smoke. In other words, progress was a game of survival. You either froze to death or suffocated. And somehow, people still chose to stay. From that, we see one truth. Medieval safety was born not from knowledge, but from fear. They didn't truly understand why something worked, only that if they didn't do it, someone would die. When the plague doctor wore his bird beak mask, he had no idea what bacteria were. He simply believed that foul smells caused disease, so he stuffed herbs and flowers inside the mask. And in a beautifully ironic twist, that useless layer of herbs actually protected him from fleas, the real culprits. Many survived not because of intelligence, but because of luck. A similar story took place in monasteries. Nuns often sprinkled ashes around the kitchen to ward off evil spirits that cause fires. In reality, that layer of ash prevented hot embers from spreading across wooden floors, one of the earliest natural fireproofing methods. When they drew crosses on walls to pray for God's protection against fire, it also reminded them not to place candles too close. And in that way, faith became the ally of safety. In the end, perhaps the greatest thing the Middle Ages left behind wasn't castles or cathedrals, but the belief that humans could learn from their mistakes. From the curfew bells ringing through the night to the plague doctor's beak mask, from monastery ash pits to the first chimneys, all prove one thing. Every tragedy carries within it a seed of wisdom. Today, when we walk into a building with smoke detectors or simply turn on a kitchen exhaust fan, it's easy to forget that these conveniences were built upon centuries of trial, failure, and desperate prayers. Medieval people knew nothing of safety science, but they knew the cost of carelessness. And perhaps it was that very fear of fire spreading through the monastery that lit something far more precious than a candle: the desire to survive. Within the cold stone walls of the monastery, where time seemed to stand still amid hymns and prayer bells, another form of power was quietly rising. No longer the power of kings or bishops, but a soft, intricate, and sometimes tragic power, that of women stripped of freedom yet still finding ways to redefine themselves. Forced into purity, they learned to turn silence into language and faith into the only weapon that could save them from oblivion. While the church imposed strict order and morality, many nuns used those very religious tools to carve out private spaces for their souls. They embroidered images of weeping saints, quietly dipping each thread into sacramental wine to tint it with sacred blood. But they knew they were telling their own stories of tears that were never allowed to fall. Some began to write, secretly recording dreams, visions, and repressed desires. They knew that ink could be burned, but once words were born, they became prayers no one could take back. These manuscripts, written in trembling Latin, sometimes mixed with the vernacular, spoke of radiant visions, where Christ was not only the Savior, but also the perfect lover, gentle and intense. Beneath the theological language lay the cries of imprisoned hearts, women trying to exist within a system that denied them desire. They turned confinement into creation. Where every prayer was a coded confession, every trance a dream of freedom. And within that very contradiction, monasteries became a unique cultural phenomenon of the Middle Ages, both prisons and laboratories of creativity. The sacred chants of Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum by Hildegard von Bingen, a nun, composer, theologian, and mystic, stand as powerful proof. Hildegard did not rebel with swords or oaths, but with intellect and voice. She transformed divine experiences, sometimes laced with sensual undertones, into music so pure that no one could condemn it. Hildegard painted a world where divine light shone through the human body, not to punish, but to redeem. But not everyone was as fortunate as Hildegard. Most other women could only dream of speaking their truth. When the prayer bell rang, they knelt again, eyes lifted toward the altar, while their minds wandered to moonlit gardens where they once whispered forbidden words. Some carried love for a priest to their dying breath. Some, accused of communing with demons, chose death by fire rather than deny what they called holy love. Church records, though steeped in prejudice, still leave traces that send chills down the spine of modern readers. The confessions, recorded with cold precision, reveal a raw truth that desire and faith are sometimes separated by only a prayer. One nun was accused of imagining union with Christ in the flesh. Yet in those lines, one hears not just sin, but a cry for deliverance. In a world where men could confess any desire and be absolved, women could only love in silence and call it a miracle. And thus, one of the Middle Ages' most heartbreaking paradoxes emerged. The Church, in its effort to suppress the body, inadvertently nurtured souls that burned brighter than any others. It taught women that the body was sinful, yet glorified them as the source of divine life. It forbade desire, yet built an entire system of ritual around symbols of blood, tears, and birth. Beauty, in the hands of the forbidden, became the subtlest act of rebellion. When the nuns embroidered flowers onto vestments, they were not merely working for God, they were stitching fragments of their forgotten souls. When they sang in the dark, those melodies did not only rise to heaven, they echoed back into the earth, where nameless children were buried, where secrets lay hidden beneath the grass. Death did not end those stories, it only made them holier in the eyes of those who came after. Today, historians reading diaries and manuscripts found at the bottoms of wooden chests cannot tell where faith ends and longing begins. But perhaps that no longer matters, for within that ambiguity, we see clearer than ever what makes us human: the need to love, to feel, and to exist on our own terms. The monastery, with all its rules and punishments, could not extinguish that light. It only made it subtler, deeper, the light of souls who refused to yield, even as they were forced to kneel. And perhaps in hindsight, we should not see them merely as sinners or saints, but as human beings, fragile, yearning, and braver than anyone ever imagined. The undercurrents within that monastic world eventually became the echo of a broader movement. Women began to write, teach, and think beyond the boundaries imposed by the church. In some parts of Europe, convents became sanctuaries of knowledge, places where nuns copied manuscripts, preserved ancient wisdom, and even debated the role of the soul in the relationship between humans and God. With every book they transcribed, with every line they interpreted, they were rewriting a part of the story of autonomy. But power never yields easily. The church considered such actions dangerous, not because they betrayed faith, but because they challenged the way faith was controlled. When a nun interpreted divine love as a free union between the soul and God, the church authorities heard within it a call for liberation. And as history often goes, ideas of freedom were suppressed before they could bloom. Yet, the seed had been sown. In Germany, scholars like Hildegard von Bingen turned the language and music of God into tools of thought. In France, Mechtild of Magdeburg wrote of divine love in such passionate prose that it made many monks blush. Their words were both prayers and manifestos of unyielding souls, spoke of Gover, of the soul as a body yearning to touch truth, a bold metaphor in an age where even emotion could be deemed sinful. Under their pens, faith ceased to be a cage and became a space for self-understanding. The nuns began to use theological language as a cloak to conceal ideas of freedom. They spoke of the union of the soul with the Holy Spirit, but on a deeper level, they were expressing the unity between desire and self, between humanity and what they believed to be divine. This very ambiguity saved them from the fires of heresy and turned them into pioneers of Europe's spiritual history. But beneath the light of knowledge, the shadow of control still loomed. Bishops ordered the burning of dangerous manuscripts. Women who dared to write of love or pain were called possessed by demons. Meanwhile, pious men secretly read their works, copying them to use as material for more orthodox sermons. Somewhere between sanctity and hypocrisy, between longing and fear, the voices of women continued to resonate, trembling but never truly silenced. By the late Middle Ages, those convents were no longer merely prisons, but laboratories. Some became centers of medicine, where nuns learned to heal with herbs and studied the human body, something forbidden to women outside. In small apothecaries, amid the scent of herbs and candle smoke, they discovered a kind of knowledge the church could not control: knowledge of life itself. That was true power, requiring no prayer, only understanding. Yet that very understanding made them feared. Rumors of witches and habits began to spread. The Inquisition turned curiosity into sin, compassion into demonic schemes. Some nuns were accused of using herbs to ease women's pain, a crime deemed as defying God's will. But ironically, it was these very women who laid the foundation for modern medicine and the understanding of the human body. Among the charred pages of the Inquisition's records, one can still find confessions written in trembling script. I only wish to heal. If that is a sin, then I sin in mercy. Those words, though silenced, still carry a smoldering light, the light of humanity. It was not open rebellion, but survival through preserving one's essence in a world determined to crush it. By the end of the 14th century, cracks in the walls of power had become visible. The collapse of major convents, the exposure of scandals, and the rise of reform movements left the church unable to hide forever. Yet whether history remembers them as sinners, fallen nuns, or witches in holy robes, one truth remains defiantly alive. They were women who dared to live, to love, and to think in an age that forbade them from doing so. When night falls upon the old monasteries and bells echo through the hollow air, one can almost imagine those souls, not begging for forgiveness, but smiling, because they knew that even in captivity, they found a way to speak what the world wished them to silence, that faith cannot exist without compassion, and that no wall is thick enough to imprison a soul longing for freedom. In that silence, history whispers a truth. Those condemned for sin were often the ones who understood the essence of holiness most deeply. When Gaveston was exiled, Edward II suffered as though he had lost a part of his soul. He sent his friend letters overflowing with affection, pleading with lords and the Pope to allow his return. But the political walls of England at that time were as thick as fortresses, and the love of a king could not triumph over the hatred of an entire court. A few months later, despite all warnings, Edward secretly summoned Gaveston back. They met on a rainy night in Windsor, and witnesses said that the king embraced his friend, tears mingling with the cold rain. For Edward, it was a sacred reunion. For the nobility, it was an act of rebellion. Fury erupted. The barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster, declared Gaveston a traitor, a worm corrupting the body of the kingdom. Secret meetings, whispered oaths, and finally a written ultimatum were sent to the royal court. Edward II, though still king in name, was now besieged within his own palace. He tried to protect his friend through decrees and public ceremonies, but no one believed in the throne anymore. When the rebels advanced, Gaveston fled with a few loyal followers, but his fate was already sealed. In 1312, at Scarborough, Gaveston was captured. The nobles promised to spare his life if he surrendered, but that promise was quickly betrayed. He was taken to Blacklow Hill, where no one loyal to the king dared to intervene. There, without trial or sentence, he was stabbed with a sword and then beheaded. Gaveston's head was displayed before the crowd, a message to Edward II. Your love, the kingdom will not tolerate. When the terrible news reached the king, it was said Edward collapsed, speechless for hours. The court reported that he mourned Gaveston as one would a wife, refusing food, refusing speech, refusing to leave the room where they once composed music together. Even chroniclers who despised him admitted that the grief could not have been feigned. But for the kingdom, one man's sorrow could not save the throne. After Gaveston, Edward grew hardened, even cruel. He sought new companions to fill the void, but none ever truly replaced him. Among the new figures who rose beside the king, the most prominent was the younger Hugh Despenser, a cunning, cold, and deeply ambitious nobleman. If Gaveston had been the bright light of youth, Despenser was the darkness that consumed the court. He did not love the king as a man, he loved power. Under Despenser's influence, Edward became a puppet in bloody political games. Lands were seized, lords were humiliated, and resentment rose once again. Throughout the court, whispers spread that Despenser controlled the king through the magic of the body, an accusation both political and moral. Amid all this, the only person strong enough to oppose Despenser was none other than Queen Isabella of France, the woman married to Edward to secure peace between the two realms. Ignored by her husband, publicly humiliated by his lover, Isabella became a proud shadow within a cold court. But behind those calm eyes brewed a storm. When Despenser seized both wealth and power, The queen quietly sent letters of appeal to Paris, and from France, the fire that would topple Edward II began to burn. In 1326, Isabella led a small army alongside her new lover, Roger Mortimer, an exiled nobleman, landing on the English coast. Strangely, no one resisted. The nobles, long oppressed under Despencer's regime, immediately surrendered. Edward II fled with his lover, but they were betrayed and captured only weeks later. When the king was shackled, it was said he asked only one question: "Where is he?" And the answer chilled the nation. Despencer had been executed in the most brutal way imaginable, dragged through the streets, stripped naked, hanged, and disemboweled alive. It was not merely punishment, it was a message. The power of desire had been crushed in the name of justice. Edward was deposed, becoming the first English king ever overthrown by his own wife. Imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, he endured his darkest days. The guards reported that the king would sit for hours beside a candle, whispering a single name: Piers. Some modern historians believe he was tortured to death. Others say he was murdered with a horrific device, a red-hot iron rod, used to punish the sins of the flesh. But some legends tell that Edward escaped and lived in hiding until the end of his life, wandering through monasteries, singing songs of love and betrayal. The truth, as always, dissolved between politics and longing. But the story of Edward II remains a strange fracture in medieval history, where love and power collided in tragedy. He was not the first king to be tormented by his heart, but he was surely the first to love openly, even at the cost of his crown and honor. Centuries later, playwrights and historians remained haunted by the tale. Christopher Marlowe turned Edward into a symbol of condemned passion. Modern filmmakers call him the most misunderstood king of England. In an age when same-sex love was seen as sin, Edward II became a symbol of what humanity has always feared: the right to love without judgment. And perhaps that is why this story still chills us, because history is not written only in triumphs, but also in broken hearts. The love of Edward and Gaveston, though stained by power, remains proof that even in the darkness of the Middle Ages, there were those who dared to love and dared to pay the price for it. In the spring of 1327, fog shrouded the damp walls of Berkeley Castle. Each night, locals claimed they heard painful cries echoing from within, a faint yet haunting sound like the moaning of a restless spirit. It was the prison of the deposed King of England, Edward II. No longer a monarch, no longer accompanied by friends or honor, he was left only with his memories, memories of love, betrayal, and loss. And for those who once worshipped him, Edward was no longer a symbol of power, but a warning to anyone who dared to place emotion above the throne. History has never agreed on the death of Edward II. Some chronicles wrote that he died of natural causes in captivity. Others, considered more credible, recount a horrifying end, that the king was executed in a way that made the world shudder. They say his executioners used no sword or blade, but a red-hot iron rod, driven into his body so as to leave no external wound. This brutal method, they said, was meant to punish the sins of the flesh, a cruel reference to his relationship with Gaveston. Whatever the truth, his death closed one of the most tragic chapters in English royal history. Isabella and Mortimer now ruled as regents for the young King Edward III. They claimed to have freed England from a weak ruler, but before long, the people realized they had merely replaced one blind man with two greedy ones. Mortimer seized absolute power, ruling through the Queen and turning the court into a theater of pride and fear. The lords who once supported the rebellion began whispering about this new tyranny. Isabella, once seen as the embodiment of resilience and vengeance, was now viewed as a conspirator in a reign built on ambition and blood. But history, as always, has no mercy for those who seize the throne for too long. Only a few years later, Edward III, the boy who had watched his father fall, came of age, and in his eyes, the innocence of youth was now replaced by the gaze of a true king. In 1330, at just 17, Edward III staged a daring coup. By night, he stormed Mortimer's chamber in Nottingham, arresting him in front of the Queen herself. Mortimer was charged with treason, and within weeks, he was hanged. A bitter end for the man who had helped topple two kings. Isabella was confined to her palace while her son began a new era, one that would bring England to fame and war, the 100 Years' War. Yet even as history tried to erase Edward II's traces, his shadow haunted England for centuries. From the monasteries of Gloucestershire to folk ballads, people still whispered that the king had never died. Some said he had escaped and lived in exile across Europe, wandering under a false name, burdened by pain and unrecognized love. Letters from an Italian monk even hinted that a man calling himself Edward of England had once come to Pisa, dressed humbly but speaking like one accustomed to commanding a nation. Did he truly survive, or was it simply humanity's pity for a forsaken soul? Either way, the story of Edward II remains a deeply human tragedy, a king born to rule, but who lived as a dreamer. He was not without courage, only without the cruelty that the throne demanded. He was not foolish, only too honest in his love. History may judge him as weak, but it is the same history that remembers him, not as a failed ruler, but as a man who loved completely. In an age when power and honor meant everything, Edward II dared to do what no one else would, to place his heart upon the throne. And perhaps that is why his story continues to captivate us. For in every era, there are still Edwards, those who don't fit the mold, who are misunderstood, and who are punished for loving differently. History is not written only by the victors, but also remembered because of people like him, souls fragile yet sincere. Edward II did not only lose his crown, he lost faith in humanity, buried beneath the prejudices of his age. Yet through the centuries, his name is still spoken with compassion, and at times even with reverence. Because in the end, what made Edward II immortal was not power, but love. A love that cost him everything, yet ensured his name would live forever in the memory of humankind. There is something strange about deposed kings. They never truly disappear. Whether buried in silence or vilified in chronicles, they continue to live on in humanity's imagination, as distorted mirrors reflecting both power and weakness. Edward II was one of those mirrors. Even after his death was declared, the story lived on, spreading through centuries of shadow where people whispered that he had never truly died. And in that very ambiguity, Edward became a symbol of a deeper fear, that power can never be separated from emotion without consequence. The reign of Edward III, the son who had witnessed his father's downfall, was a fierce reaction against every mistake his father had made. The boy grew up surrounded by whispers about his father's weakness, his debauchery, and a love that had brought down a kingdom. And when Edward III ascended the throne, he knew that to restore royal authority, he had to bury forever the image of his gentle father. His reign became a spectacle of strength, victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and the expansion of the English Empire across Europe. Yet behind every triumph, a ghost lingered, the man who had failed not because he lacked power, but because he had dared to love. In monasteries and castles, the tale of Edward II was told as both a warning and, at times, a prayer. Monks wrote that he was punished for placing love above duty, while common folk told of a kind king betrayed by those he trusted most. The story mirrored the shared obsession of the Middle Ages, the fear of passion, and the yearning to be loved without being destroyed by it. Somewhere between those two extremes, Edward II was crushed, and because of that, he became one of the most human figures in English history. Centuries later, when Shakespeare wrote Richard II, many scholars saw the shadow of Edward II in every tragic verse, a poetic king betrayed by those he cherished, imprisoned and dying in solitude. It is no surprise that Edward II became the archetype for countless tragic characters thereafter, from Hamlet to the romantic kings of 19th century novels. He symbolized something power could never conceal, that even those who wear crowns have hearts that can break. What's remarkable is that his betrayers, Isabella and Mortimer, were not spared their fate either. Mortimer's death, dangling from the gallows at Tyburn, was not merely personal vengeance, but a ritual of purification for the entire kingdom. When Edward III ordered his execution, many believed it was also the young king's way of killing his father's ghost, erasing all traces of weakness. As for Isabella, once called the she-wolf of France, she ended her days in isolation, wandering the cold halls of Castle Rising Abbey, carrying with her small effigies of Edward II and Gaveston, proof of an obsession she could never escape. History, as always, shows no mercy to those who love the wrong person. But perhaps what makes Edward II special is not that he failed, but that he failed so humanly. He was not a great warrior, nor a shrewd politician. He was a man trapped between affection and duty, between personal longing and the burden of the crown. That is precisely why his story outlived those who destroyed him, because unlike victory, tragedy always endures longer in human memory. Today, looking back at the brief reign of Edward II, historians recognize that within the chaos lay something precious. He had unknowingly laid the groundwork for a new understanding of power. After him, a king could no longer rule by emotion alone, but neither could he rule without a heart. Edward III and the monarchs who followed learned to wear a mask of cold authority, but that mask was forged from Edward II's own tears. One might say his reign failed, but his legacy did not. From peasant revolts to charters of noble rights, all carried the lesson of a king betrayed for believing in humanity. And perhaps that is the greatest irony. He was called the weak king, yet it was that very weakness that made England stronger. A kingdom that learned power could not rely on fear alone. As twilight falls over Berkeley Castle, people still say that sometimes footsteps can be heard echoing through the empty corridors or sighs drifting among the cold stones. Some claim it is the spirit of Edward II, forever searching for his lost companion. But perhaps it is not just the ghost of a king. It is the echo of love, a love that transcended the throne, transcended time itself, reminding us that no matter how cruel history may be, the human heart remains the most powerful force of all. When the Pope's order of investigation arrived, Paris erupted. A king of France, a servant of the Roman Church, was now accused of lying before God. The entire court trembled. Philip II, once seen as the embodiment of wisdom and piety, was now under Rome's scrutiny. The bishops were divided. Some claimed the king was possessed by demons, while others whispered that he had wagered his soul to protect some secret, a secret known only to him and Ingeborg. Meanwhile, at the Abbey of Étampes, where she was imprisoned, Ingeborg lived her lonely but steadfast days. She refused all comfort, praying and writing instead. Her letters, sent to Rome and to the courts of Northern Europe, became her sharpest weapon against the king. Every word she wrote was like an oath. I will not bow to the sin of the man who betrayed me. I am queen before God, and I shall die with that title. It is hard to believe, but from a powerless prisoner, Ingeborg made all of Europe listen. From Denmark to England, from the monasteries of Bruges to the Holy See in Rome, her name was spoken with reverence and pity. Pope Celestine III, though reluctant at first, eventually declared the marriage lawful and ordered Philip to take his wife back. But instead of obeying, the King of France chose to defy the Pope. He convened a new council at Compiègne, declaring Rome's decision erroneous and reaffirming the annulment. It was an unprecedented act, a king daring to stand against the supreme religious authority of Europe. In response, the Pope excommunicated him. The entire kingdom of France was placed under interdict, a severe spiritual punishment. Churches were closed, bells fell silent, no masses were held, no funerals, no weddings. The souls of the nation hung suspended between sin and despair. For the people, it was a nightmare. They believed their souls would never reach heaven. The candles in churches were extinguished, and holy statues were veiled in black cloth. But Philip remained defiant. In his fury, he sent Ingeborg to a more remote convent, cutting off all contact. She is possessed, he declared, a curse in the form of a woman. Yet, the more he tried to silence her, the louder her voice became. The monks, loyal to the Pope, began circulating copies of her letters. Some claimed to have seen her in their dreams, her face glowing in candlelight, her eyes filled with tears yet unyielding. She had become a symbol of faith betrayed, a martyr of love and justice. In the years that followed, Philip tried to erase the scandal by remarrying. In 1196, he wed Agnes of Merania, a union the Pope immediately declared unlawful. Agnes was branded the king's sinful mistress. When their first child was born, Rome declared the baby illegitimate. This time, Pope Innocent III intervened, a man firm and unyielding. He issued an ultimatum: either Philip abandon Agnes and take Ingeborg back, or the entire kingdom of France would be cut off from the church. History records that when the decree was read aloud, the church bells of Paris rang into a chilling silence. The people were terrified. Merchants stopped trading, and priests trembled in the shadows. At last, Philip submitted. He ordered Ingeborg's release, allowing her to return to court as queen in name only. But it was no reconciliation, merely submission to Rome's power. Agnes, the woman he truly loved, was forced to leave France. Not long after, she died in solitude, said to be from illness or a broken heart. That event marked one of the deepest stains on the Capetian dynasty. Philip, once proud as Augustus, the restorer of France, had turned his throne into a battleground between desire and faith. For the rest of his life, he and Ingeborg lived in the same palace but never spoke. No apology, no explanation, only two silent shadows passing each other in the cold corridors of the old Louvre. And yet, history has a strange way of restoring justice. After Philip's death, Ingeborg was finally recognized as the lawful queen. She lived past the age of 70, devoting her remaining years to charity, and was buried in the Abbey of Saint Jean, where the inscription on her tomb simply read, Regina per Dei voluntatem, Queen by the will of God. Today, historians look back on the scandal as a symbolic tragedy, a man who used power to escape emotion, and a woman who used faith to defy a throne. Love, regret, and Philip's obsession remain a mystery, but Ingeborg's legacy is clear. She triumphed not by sword or crown, but through endurance and faith. Like Edward II of England, her story stands as proof of one thing. In the Middle Ages, where honor and power were often measured in blood, there were still souls who chose to suffer rather than betray their hearts. And it was they, the imprisoned, the forgotten, the so-called mad, who ensured that history would never sleep peacefully. However, Queen Ingeborg's return was not the triumphant homecoming people imagined. When she entered the French court, those who had long forgotten her now greeted her with a strange reserve and silence. In the dim light of royal candles, the woman who had been imprisoned for 20 years appeared not as a fragile victim, but as a symbol of quiet strength. Her hair had turned silver, her figure had grown thin, but her eyes still carried the light of faith, something even the throne could not extinguish. It was said that when she stepped into the Great Hall, some courtiers bowed their heads, not out of duty but out of respect for a woman who had endured more than the men who had gone to war. But for the king, the reunion only stirred memories no one wished to recall. Between them, there was no love, no trust, only history and duty. Philip II, now a powerful monarch, could not escape the shadow of the past. In Ingeborg, he saw not just his lawful wife, but the symbol of his submission to Pope Innocent III, the man who had once forced him to his knees through sacred decrees. Thus, even though Ingeborg was restored to her title, she was kept at a distance just far enough to prevent her from touching the king's glory. Servants recorded that every morning she woke before the sun. She prayed for the soul of Agnes, the woman who had stolen her life, and for Philip, the man who had ruined it. Once when a maid asked why she prayed for those who had caused her such pain, she simply smiled and said, "Because God loves even the lost souls." That sentence spread throughout the court, silencing even those who had once despised her. Ingeborg's patience and forgiveness not only earned the admiration of the church, but also changed how people viewed power and dignity in women during the Middle Ages. In an era when queens were remembered only through political marriages, she became a figure of faith and compassion. A nun from the convent where she had once been confined wrote, "She needs no crown, for the radiance around her is grace itself." Meanwhile, the king, though victorious in politics, was never truly at peace. Philip II was praised as the unifier of France, yet history etched his name with the tale of the forgotten wife. When Agnes died, he mourned her. When Ingeborg returned, he could not meet her gaze. Those close to him said he sometimes dreamed of a woman in a nun's robe, silently watching him with eyes full of mercy. He woke drenched in sweat, not knowing whether it was Agnes, Ingeborg, or his own conscience. Their contrast was the classic tragedy of the Middle Ages, a man consumed by ambition and power, and a woman imprisoned by faith and kindness. In her later years, Ingeborg lived quietly in Saint Jean d'Acre, where she funded churches and cared for orphans. She was no longer seen as the Queen of France, but as a saint of forgiveness. Pilgrims often sought her counsel, and some said that when she prayed, the air in the room seemed to grow clearer. Philip II died in 1223, carrying the glory of an expanding empire and the guilt he never confessed. In his will, he made no mention of Ingeborg, but ordered the construction of a new chapel at Notre Dame for the souls of those who suffered because of my sins. Many historians believe it was a silent confession to her. When she heard of his death, Ingeborg simply said, "May God forgive him, as I once did." And then, as if history itself wished to restore justice to that woman, after Philip's death, the French began to speak her name again, with reverence. Monastic records described her as the most holy queen of France. Northern chroniclers saw her as a symbol of steadfast faith amid injustice. She lived many more years, not in splendor but in peace, the kind she had traded her whole life to obtain. When Ingeborg died, she was buried with the title of queen amid the long tolling of bells, the very sound once silenced by her marriage. People gathered outside the church, not to mourn a queen, but to bid farewell to a soul who had lived as proof that compassion can be stronger than power, and that the silence of the righteous can make even the mightiest kings bow their heads. Today, when people speak of King Philip II, they remember him as a great ruler. But when they speak of Ingeborg, they call her the unyielding heart of France. Their story remains a reminder that amidst the schemes and violence of the Middle Ages, there were still souls who triumphed, not by the sword, but by faith. And it was that faith, not the throne, that became the true legacy left behind. It is ironic how history always finds a way to grant wounded souls their own form of immortality. After Ingeborg's death, chroniclers in monasteries began to speak of her not as a political figure, but as a religious symbol. The story of the steadfast wife of France spread across Europe, from the mist-covered monasteries of Denmark to the banquet halls of Parisian nobility. There, amid tales of war and glory, the name Ingeborg echoed as a reminder of the strength of faith, of a woman who triumphed without ever wielding a sword. In the medieval world where a man's honor was defended with blood, the silence of a woman could shake a throne. Ingeborg never led a rebellion, never challenged the church, nor called for allies. She only wrote letters, small letters sent to Rome, humble in tone, yet powerful in spirit. "I am still his wife," she wrote, "and I pray for him every day that God may enlighten his heart." Those words, seemingly fragile, compelled popes, cardinals, and even the most powerful men in Europe to act. A prayer became an indictment, and a forgotten woman became the voice of conscience for an entire kingdom. That strength, the strength of perseverance, was what made Ingeborg different. In an age when women were treated as possessions, she dared to redefine her worth. She needed no throne to prove her power. It was her endurance and dignity that made her a true queen in the eyes of the people. Centuries later, when historians revisited the chronicles, they realized her image had transcended politics. She had become a metaphor for faith that cannot be imprisoned, a virtue that even kings, with all their power over life and death, had to bow before. What is remarkable is that even after her death, her influence burned quietly like a candle that lasts through the long night of the Middle Ages. Nuns in northern France began to regard her as the patron saint of women who had suffered injustice. They embroidered her image on altar cloths, with a serene gaze and hands clasped in prayer. In Denmark, hymns were written in memory of the princess who brought honor to her homeland through patience. And gradually, in the consciousness of Europe, Ingeborg was no longer a victim. She was the ultimate victor of a cruel era. Yet what makes her story truly great is not its tragedy, but how it illuminates human nature. Philip II, a great king, unifier of France and conqueror of England, was ultimately defeated not by enemies, but by memory. In his later years, as he commissioned the building of Notre Dame and funded monastic orders, he was not only seeking redemption before God, but perhaps trying to find the peace that Ingeborg had long possessed. She forgave him. He, perhaps, never forgave himself. Modern scholars often view their relationship as a prime example of the conflict between power and conscience. On one side stood a king embodying ambition, desire, and pride. On the other, a woman representing faith, virtue, and unshakable steadfastness. That battle between strength and morality was not fought on a battlefield, but within the heart of a kingdom. And when the final curtain fell, victory belonged to the one who never fought at all. That is why, even to this day, Ingeborg's story holds a strange allure. It is not merely the tragedy of a failed marriage, but a mirror of an era, one in which the most powerful could lose their humanity, and only compassion could redeem them. In today's world, where history often glorifies conquerors, her story reminds us that some victories can only be won through kindness. It is said that when her remains were placed in the small tomb at St. Gian, the candles around her coffin burned for 3 nights without going out. The monks saw it as a miracle, but perhaps it was only a symbol, the light of a soul that never went dark. For though time may erase the victories of kings, it cannot erase the memory of a woman who taught the world a lesson in patience, faith, and the power of forgiveness. In history, Ingeborg left behind no empire, no descendants bearing her name, no grand monuments or war songs, but she left a legacy far more precious, the truth that dignity can endure even as power fades. And perhaps in the chaotic world of the Middle Ages, where blood, power, and faith constantly clashed, her story stands as a reminder that sometimes the true victor is the one who quietly stands firm in the storm. The world of kings was often built on blood, stone, and fear, but Ingeborg's legacy was built on faith and endurance. When modern chroniclers speak of her, they do not merely speak of a woman cast aside. They speak of an era in which justice did not belong to the strong, but to those who dared to believe they were right. Ingeborg had no army, no power, and no throne to protect her. Her only weapon was silence. Yet it was that very silence that made all of France listen. She did not fight Philip with anger, but with unyielding perseverance. Each time the court issued a new decree to erase her name from history, monks quietly copied her prayers, as if to keep the flame of justice alive. The people whispered her name during ceremonies, not out of pity, but out of respect. For in Ingeborg, they saw the image of a woman who refused to let her dignity be buried beneath the false splendor of the court. In a world of darkness and devotion to power, she was the rare candle that dared to stand firm in the wind. What makes her story timeless is that it not only tells the past, but also mirrors the present. We still see the Philips of this world, those willing to sacrifice righteousness to preserve power. And we still see the Ingeborgs, those who choose silence, not out of weakness, but because they understand that truth does not need to shout. Her true strength lay in her ability to make history remember her not through violence, but through the endurance of her spirit. Today, scholars regard Ingeborg as the first model of silent feminism in European history. She did not need to destroy the system to prove her worth. She made that very system contradict itself until it collapsed under the weight of its own conscience. And perhaps that was the greatest victory, a triumph that required no arch of triumph, only time. When posterity speaks her name alongside Jeanne d'Arc or Blanche of Castile, they are not only honoring a woman, but the spirit that dared to stand firm against injustice. In the old churches of France, one can still find her statue, small, humble, yet placed where the morning light always shines directly upon it. Perhaps that is history's way of saying that, though centuries have passed, Ingeborg's light has never gone out. And somewhere in the echo of church bells ringing through the ancient stone vaults, one can still hear her quiet message that faith, however fragile, can still conquer an empire.